$1.99 in Sussex.
Was it really?
Yeah, that's true. When I went past it.
$1.74 in Kenosha.
Really?
174.
I'm gonna have to fill up.
Don't you have that 5,000-gallon tank at your house, John?
Ready to go?
Nobody'd want one of those.
I think so.
Good. All right, we'll call over the Town of Lisbon and Village of Sussex Joint Planning Commission meeting to order on Wednesday, March 11th, 2020 at 6:15 p.m. Roll call, please.
Present for the Town of Lisbon, Town Chairman Joe Osterman.
Here.
Supervisor Polotecker. Here. Plan Commission Member Mark Meyer.
Here.
Myself, Administrator Gina Gresh. Josh Langen, Town Planner.
Here.
Michael Van Clunen, Town Attorney.
Here.
And Sussex.
Annette Kramer, President. Scott Atkins, President. Village President Greg Getz. Administrator Jeremy Smith. And our Attorney John Macy.
Excellent. Thank
And
you.
Casey Fluids in the back.
In case you flew it in the back.
Item 3 is comments from citizens present. Does anyone wish to make any comments tonight? All right. Item 4 is discussion and necessary action on the minutes of the Joint Planning Committee meeting from December 17th, 2019.
I'll make a motion to accept the minutes from December 17th, 2019 as presented.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Motion made and seconded. Any discussion? All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion carries 5-0. Mark Meyer was not here for that meeting. He abstained.
Okay.
All right. Item 5 is joint planning areas. A, discussion and necessary action on the request from the property owner, Amin Hamdan, for the applicant David Baum for the property located on the corner of Corey Corners Parkway and County Highway K, LSBT 0284.994.001, for a proposed truck wash and recommendation of the Town and Village Plan Commissions of the same if necessary. All right. How you
Okay.
doing?
About 3 months ago, we came forward.
Could you state your name?
Name is David Baum with Schrader and Holt Architects. With me is Amin, the owner of the property. About 3 months ago, we came before the board, the Lisbon Town Board, to discuss the opportunity to put a truck wash on the corner of Lisbon and Highway F. At that time, we got approval from the Town of Lisbon to a conditional acceptance, if you will. We will accept this if you do it the right way. We were then instructed to go to the Town of Sussex to get their approval. We were working with Sussex. The Town of Sussex, the City of Sussex said, Village of Sussex said, we don't need to have a conversation. Let's go straight to the Joint Commission. So today we are here at the Joint Commission to get an understanding whether the use of a truck wash at this location will be acceptable. We would like to get approval of the use before we try and design a building, go through the whole formal process, and do all the drawings required for that submittal. So that's what we're asking tonight is this an acceptable use to both communities so that we can proceed forward with providing the necessary documentations to get a formal approval of the architectural aesthetics, the formal site plan, the formal civil engineering plans to construct a truck wash for the community.
Okay. Josh, you have any comments?
It's fairly self-explanatory. There is a process to do this, and that's basically everyone gives approval to either permit the use as permitted use or as a conditional use. The applicant has stated that they would like the use to be classified as a permitted use.
Correct.
Jeremy?
We'll actually have John talk about this in a little bit.
Well, we couldn't discern from the documents submitted, and the planners just indicated that they want a permitted use, but is there any details? Conditional use, obviously, under the new law, we have to set forth all the requirements and conditions, as you know. And so if the town was contemplating doing its conditional use, it was our feelings we needed to see what the conditions were going to be. because it's premature in this day and age to create a new conditional use without setting forth all of those requirements or conditions. You can't add conditions, as we know, later on. It's very difficult to do. And so from our perspective, a staff's perspective, we thought we needed more information as to the permitted versus the conditional. Has the town discussed whether they had a preference one way or another?
I wasn't at the town board meeting, but it sounds like they gave permission to go forward. And, if the JPC wants to allow this as a permitted use, they can do so. It's just really up to what you want to recommend.
I think more of it in the zoning code is being this is a joint planning area, I think that's where it gets hairy.
It is not a not permitted use. It's not specified that you cannot have this. So therefore, is it an acceptable use, or do we need to have it as a conditional use?
Yeah, it just says quite clearly, other uses not specified mentioned above may be permitted uses of the Town of Lisbon Plan Commission, Town of Lisbon Board, and the JPC make the following findings. You have to make 4 findings. Uses consistent with the intent and type of uses that are already permitted in B4. Use is not listed as a conditional use, which it's not. Use is not one of the prohibited uses, which it's not. And use is safe, clean, would not cause hardship to neighboring properties from noise pollution or other nuisance. If you make those 4 findings, you can classify this as a permitted use. If you don't, you can basically do the same thing, but simply designate this as a conditional use, in which case this would all have to go through the CUP process.
From a planning perspective, one area of concern is the intensity of truck traffic already at that intersection. Has there been any studies done with respect to traffic with this use?
We have
At
not
that
seen a
location.
traffic impact study.
This is very preliminary here. Obviously, he's coming forward, he doesn't have building plans yet, just to see if this is something that we're both going to accept or not before he spends money on this stuff, is what I'm assuming.
Yeah, we can provide a truck traffic study during the process, but if neither community wants this as a viable business in the community, then we need to decide what we want to do. And we understand that there is a need for it in the area.
At least keep the trucks clean.
Yeah.
There's 1,000 trucks a day that comes out of the quarry between both quarries.
If
All
this
question-
were to be a permitted use, it would have to go through site plan review. That would give us an opportunity to look at it more closely as well. So just because it's not a CUP doesn't necessarily mean it won't have further review with regards to traffic improvements needed, deceleration lanes, left-hand turn lanes, intersection upgrades, whatever the case might be.
Yeah, it's a tough corner as it is already with traffic on that corner, or that intersection rather.
I think from the town perspective, we were looking at, working together with you guys in this. If you want it to be a CUP, I'm sure we could go through the CUP process. The permitted use, there's quarries all around there. It is definitely something that's needed. As far as the intersection goes, there's no residential over there. There's some residential down further, but nothing that's going to be affected by this. The trucks are already there. You're not putting a huge draw here. There's, like you said, 1,000 trucks coming out of those quarries a day already.
Yeah, that intersection's already at a D level intersection. I wonder, and I throw this to our members, whether if the town could create what the rules for the CU would be, that we could then consider as a JPC, because I think there's reasonableness to
To make
the
it a
request,
CU.
but let's see what the conditions are with the new CU law that the town would propose, that then the JPC could look at those rules and say, yes, let's officially make it a CU. I think there's a desire to try to work together where we can work together.
Absolutely.
Cross traffic, the 1,000 trucks a day are coming out of the north side of the intersection. Now this will take them to the south side of the intersection, and I don't know what that means from a traffic standpoint, but we know that intersection's problematic, and that is going to be one of the biggest areas, so I think, for the village's concerns with what happens at that intersection already. But I think there's a willingness to try to see if we can't can't find a way for this business to proceed. So, John, I throw that out there. If they could, the town could, through their plan commission, because you really should create what rules you want to see under a CU.
And you have
then
more
we
control of
could
the
then we could take
conditional use,
an actual code document to say here is what this would be, and then we can adopt it as a JPC.
So the village would prefer a CU process, see what it's gonna come back with it, and see what the rules are gonna be required for it.
Under the
But
old
you're open to this happening.
I think so. I mean that I
Yes.
asked the plan commission, the joint plan
I
commission.
think you have, and plus you have more control with the CU too,
Yeah, I mean, that's why we're here.
versus a permitted use, so I think a CU
Somewhat.
would be. Yeah, that's true. I think that works for us.
I do have a question. When they say it's a truck wash, and you're talking about quarry trucks,
Every kind of truck, not
any kind
quarry.
of truck?
Any
Okay.
kind of truck.
Okay.
We got businesses like Sur, they want their truck washed there.
Yeah. We
They
got,
wash it right in their parking lot.
Tractor trailers?
Tractor trailers, yes,
Yeah.
we'll have them.
we got
because-
tanker
Store
trucks,
type thing.
milk trucks, they need to be
Yes.
washed internally.
Yeah,
They need a place for that wash to happen
Right.
too.
Manufacturing, right? It's-
So we've got a variety of different trucks that need to be washed.
semis, yeah, food.
Yeah. So we're planning for the ability to wash a semi inside and out of a tanker truck.
Sanitize them because they
Yes.
carry food.
I don't know if that's a little more information for the, maybe you were aware of that.
I didn't know about the inside of the trucks, but.
Yeah, I
the
didn't
outside
realize that
of it,
either,
Yeah, that's new.
that they're gonna sanitize the inside.
Yeah.
One other thing we did notice in looking at the plan, and it may just be initial plan, was they were showing a metal building, which obviously isn't allowed
Yeah.
by the design standards.
No.
Yeah.
And that's, we threw those drawings together just to have something for discussion. And then when we started looking into the rules and requirements of the communities, the two communities have similar but different requirements. One of the questions we have is, which rules do we need to follow? Lisbon or Sussex? Or do we have to make sure both of them are met?
We can get
take
you
the
a
most,
copy of what needs to be there, but I mean, there's gonna have to be some architecture there. I mean, you look at Gordy's concrete pump factory over there.
yeah,
That's kinda what we're looking for.
okay.
So I think that would be,
Yep.
Yeah, and that's, we just need a clarification on that. And the
No
other,
metal exterior.
Correct.
you know, you can't have an all metal building, that's.
no, no. And we look at the other, we drew these drawings based on the other buildings that are in the area, very industrial buildings.
Well, the
thinking-
stuff on the other side of Betker, you know, on backside there on Betker Drive, that's really old stuff.
It is,
Yeah.
but we were basing everything on that, so,
Yeah, this is a little bit different area that falls into what's considered the joint planning area, that's why we're at the JPC.
yeah, and that's why we're here today is which rules do we follow? Where do we have to go with this?
We can get you those.
Yeah, so we didn't provide a full submittal because we're not sure exactly what to follow.
Well, it sounds like both communities are open to it, we'll just have to do it as a CUP process,
Okay?
so we can get you the
And-
information.
Who do I need to work with to move this forward? Do I work with,
Got it right on the end there.
Lisbon.
work with Josh?
Yes.
And then
Gina?
obviously it'll be joint with Sussex on this too. We'll talk.
Well, do I have to go meet with Lisbon? Do I have to go meet with Sussex? Do I have to have dual meetings for everything? Or
Start
do I
with
just
us.
start with you guys?
Yeah,
Okay?
so, and if if you guys don't have joint meetings with it, I'm sure that's not gonna be an issue.
Sure. What we've done in the past is the town's planners come and met over with our staff to say, here's what we're recommending, what comments
Sure.
do you have? We try to make this relatively easy.
Sure.
I think from the JPC standpoint, we would just look to see what code regulations you write up for this, that then the JPC can adopt for the B4 commercial district.
Right. If we can get some of that hammered out ahead of time, that would be,
Sure.
Sure.
The sooner the better, I think, for everybody.
Yes, for everybody. And then the whole landscaping issue is based on street frontage. I got a long panhandle.
It's already trees on there
There's
already.
trees all over that. Is that going to be considered that it's already landscaped? I don't have to work with that? Or
It's in
do
the
I have to
design
build a
standards.
forest?
It's in the design standards.
yeah, there's design standards for it,
Okay.
so
So we'll
that's
work
something
with,
you can work with the planner on and.
we'll work with
obviously-
Josh and Gina and get that forwarded.
So to be clear, I mean, this does, if you want to wait for us to mock up conditions, we'll have to do this again. You can see the mocked up conditions to say yes or no, whether this is something we need, and then make the decision then. Then it's going to be CUP, then it's going to come back to you again. So you'll see this twice.
First, we're making the code change.
Oh,
and then we're reviewing the site plan and the
Right.
documents themselves.
Okay.
What are we talking for a time frame on this? How long is it going to take you guys to make the code change? How long is it going to take for us to go through the CUP process?
So that's something you can discuss with the planner in Sussex. If you're looking for an exact time frame right now, you ain't gonna get it.
Looking for an idea.
Summer, we're gonna get it
Yeah,
going.
that's something you can tend with the planner and then with Sussex. It takes longer when we have a joint planning area.
Okay.
That it does.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't
Okay.
give you an exact time because it's when you get your information in, when does it get submitted, when you have meetings, when you review it. If you miss a meeting, what happens?
Right.
You know, we do this kind of thing and we say dates and then all of a sudden you guys miss something and you're like, well, you told us it would be this. So
For general planning purposes, best case scenario, do I have a
just
3-month process? Do I have a 9-month process?
it's all going to depend. Honestly, I would hope not 9 months.
Okay.
But I mean, Josh, you can talk with Josh after the meeting if you want, and Gina, and they can get you some time frames.
Okay.
I mean, I would think we could get you a designation, get you on the books as a use one way or another pretty soon. I mean, you're indicating that we need to submit conditions, but I don't think that necessarily, I mean, again, our conditions are going to be contingent upon what they submit. So until we get a full submittal, it's hard us to draw up all our conditions because we won't know what's missing. So we'll just have to send you, you know, the big ticket items that we know we're gonna, you know, want to look at, traffic impact study, you know, some things like that. But you see what I mean? We can't give you a full list of CUP conditions until we have a full CUP. Again, chicken and egg, they're not going to want to draft an entire CUP until they at least get permission to move forward and have their designation on the books. So we're going to be a little bit in the gray area.
Generally, I want to work with you to make sure that what I'm submitting is meeting the requirements, but the requirements aren't fully defined yet? Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah.
Because it's not a use that's currently in the code. We have to establish it as a use in the code with, and you know, prior to 2 years ago, this would have been a fairly straightforward process. But the new state law on CUs, that really is complicated
Really
matters
different.
for communities about the conditions.
We don't have a truck wash named in our code, so we got to figure
yeah.
this out.
Yeah, it's something
We'll just make
different.
it plain. That's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
We want to work with you. I know Sussex wants to work with you,
Sure.
but we're gonna have to get it figured out. You'll have to work with staff to figure out a time frame, and nobody's gonna delay it. I mean,
Okay.
we're not looking to.
So generally, the use of a truck wash is acceptable to both communities, provided the design and layout meet the requirements of each community,
And this conditional
CU.
use, yeah, we can come to an agreement on.
thus the requirements.
Yeah.
Yep.
But the design, and Josh, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, the design standards are already in the code.
Yes.
Exhibit 11 or whatever
Yeah,
it
so
is,
that's-
and I looked it up on the way here, so, I mean, those aren't going to change.
Correct. And we've seen those, and
Well, at
we
least that's
have.
in the village.
Pardon? Well, not without going through the whole process. Nobody's talking about it as part of this process. I didn't mean to
I mean, we
premature
say,
that you weren't going to change them.
Gordy's is a prime example of something, a design that we're looking for.
Let's just be sure here, though. If you do not make a decision here tonight, he could come back and your 3 decisions are permitted use, conditional use, or prohibited. So I cannot say yes when you ask us, are we generally okay that this is going to be either permitted or conditional until we actually have a vote of some sort. Because like I said, you could not put it on the books. You could say, I'm sorry, we think this is prohibited use. We do not agree to make it prohibited or conditional. That's, I mean, this, you're leaving him in kind of legal limbo. That's
Yep.
okay, but I just want him to be clear, because he asked the question. I just want to be clear.
Well, first, not permitted is always an option because it's not in the code. We've already ruled out permitted. You know, the body here has said, as I heard it, that if they want it to come, if it's going to come back, it's going to come back as a conditional use.
And tonight you have the ability to say.
So you want a motion that we'd like to have you guys prepare a conditional use for this project.
If you honestly think that it's going to be a conditional use and not permitted, you go right ahead.
I think we want, yeah. What do you think?
Well, we don't take conceptual motions, you know. The village doesn't, I don't know
Yeah.
what the town does. Because then, just as you said, on time frames, they rely on it, and then you get stuck. And so, I mean, one of the answers to them is write it out. You know, we have all kinds of sample condition uses in both communities, and you could write up and submit it to Josh that this is what the conditions are that you're proposing. He said he would need more detail to know that what he wrote was consistent. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, to be consistent with your plans. Well, they know their plans. I have many individuals now who are writing the conditional uses, sometimes with the assistance of their counsel, but they submit it and say, these are the 10 conditions, or these are the 5 conditions that would work for us. And that helps, helps move it along, and it helps to make sure we're not back and forth writing conditions that you couldn't live with. For instance, do you want 24 hours a day? How big is the parcel? The minimum size of the land? We already know the zoning. That's not an issue. I'm just throwing out things that...
Sure.
So we have individuals, and maybe people we've worked with in your company, who have come forward and said, Josh, here's our proposal for some language for a conditional use. Let's start with that.
Mm-hmm.
That'll move things along if you submit that quickly.
Yeah,
Is that a fair statement?
It's just whether this board wants to take action on this tonight, which they can, or not.
Question being,
Well, we can't take action on it tonight, can we?
You could, but
I don't know what the action is. The conditional
Designate
use,
this as a permitted or a conditional use or prohibited.
how can you, well, I can't recommend to our members that they vote on a conditional use that they don't know what the conditions are.
No, they're just
That would be
designating,
premature.
saying this is allowed in B4 as a conditional use. And then the whole process starts.
yeah, then we
put their
define the
application
conditions.
together, we get the conditions together, we review it, and we bring it back to this board and say, here's their CUP. It's basically just a designation of the CUP.
Yeah, which direction? I got 3 prongs of a fork. Which direction do I follow? It's not allowed, it is allowed, or I have to go down the conditional
The
use.
only way it's gonna be allowed is conditional, is what what's being
That's what I'm
sensed here.
hearing,
Yeah.
but it needs to be approved that it has to go through the conditional use process.
Well, it doesn't have to be approved here tonight that it's going through the conditional use, but we're talking about
At
if-
least
whether or
vote
not a
on it.
motion is appropriate to designate that it would be a conditional use.
Right.
That's what we're looking to talk about here.
so a motion could be, and I'm not saying you want to do this, a motion could be to direct the town to prepare a conditional use order for consideration at the next JPC meeting. Or a conditional use ordinance change is probably a better way to say
Which
that.
is not an approval, it's just a direction. That
Direction. So,
basically doing what we said we're gonna do, just
Yeah.
putting it in
For
a
a
form
truck
of
wash.
motion.
Yeah.
Truck
Specifically
wash.
say for a truck wash.
John?
Just so they know, there's no guarantee.
Yeah, that doesn't mean it's gonna be a conditional use.
Not
It could
gonna
be,
mean that it's
turn out
gonna
being
be
permitted,
approved.
but at least it gives direction to prepare something.
At least we know where to go. At least we know what to do.
So moved, is there a second?
Go ahead.
I'll second that.
All right, now discussion. So, we're making a motion that we might,
We have a direction to go in. We have to work with staff to define the conditional use requirements and make a presentation on that at the next joint meeting.
I don't know if it's gonna go to the plan commission next or the joint. You guys can figure that out.
Yeah,
Okay.
you could go to planning commission first.
Okay.
Yeah.
That'll work.
Any other discussion? Anything from staff? Any staff? Whole bunch of staff here tonight? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries 6-0.
Okay,
All right.
thank you.
Item B, discussion and necessary action on the Town of Lisbon's 4-lot certified survey map for the property located at North 63 West 22039 County Road F, tax key LSBT 0241.999, known as the Leeds property. Josh, you want to start us out?
We have a CSM put together. Sandieth County has looked through it. Memorandum was sent Casey Fluid with 7 conditions. This memorandum was dated February 27th, 2020. Town of Lisbon CSM, corner of F and D. There were 7 conditions. The first 2 are about bearings. They've been fixed. The third one, existing zoning on lots 7, 8A, 8B, and 9, incorrectly listed as A3. They should be M1. That was fixed, according to our engineer. Lots 1, 2, and 3 should be zone BP. 1. That has not been fixed. That's an outstanding issue. The proposed road name should be shown in the CSM. That has not been fixed. 6 is something about an iron pipe. It's been fixed. 7, length and bearing of center lines, that's been fixed. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at this CSM. We have a question as why this would be BP1, but essentially, this was your opportunity to discuss the CSM if you wanted to.
Sure. It kind of goes part and parcel with the next agenda item that we'll be going into the history of the BP1 and where we're going. From a staff perspective for our members, we don't believe the CSM has any concerns from a setup standpoint. Obviously, we agree with the county's conditions on them, but I think we would find it, or staff would recommend to you, you recommend approval of the CSM subject to meeting all the conditions from the county. That would be which includes the BP1. That would be the staff's recommendation to the village board or to the JPC.
You're saying the county is recommending BP1 zoning?
I believe that was the conditions from the county, correct? Am I reading that incorrectly?
I'm just going off of the. Yeah, where's that? From. Actually, this memo is from village engineer.
Oh, it's from the village engineer. Okay.
Yeah, it's from the-
I thought it was from the county. Yeah.
That's to John.
So we would, to clarify, we'd recommend
The BP.
you recommend approval of the CSM per the village attorney's conditions review.
So the county,
Village engineer, sorry.
the county has accepted the M2 zoning and passed it. So I wouldn't think they would,
Has it been passed, or is it still going through the process?
it should be done. That was last week, I think? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I went to the county board last week. I'm not sure which day it was, but I could find out. Do you have that, Gina?
Yeah, that's why we're questioning, just because it's an engineer comment, we don't necessarily have to act on that comment.
Yeah, and I think at the next agenda item, we'll get into that rationale.
Obviously, the road name, that's fine. This is the only outstanding issue. If there is an issue, but again, this is your opportunity to comment. We'll record those comments.
Sure, without going into great detail, because we're going to talk about it at the next agenda item.
February 21st, it was approved at the county level.
Was that all the way through, or the first committee?
That's the final one. We can pull it up just to confirm
Sure.
that was.
There has been a long-standing disagreement between the two communities about certain special districts, this being one of them, or the disagreement of the same, and that the town's zoning code called for this property to be zoned BP1, which is why that comment comes in from the village perspective. So, again, to staff's point, to our members, we'd recommend you make a motion to recommend approval subject to it being properly zoned BP1, or conditioned upon being zoned BP1.
I will make that motion. I so move.
I'll second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion carried.
Well, hold on. You gotta have everybody vote. I'm assuming it's going to. I'm
At
assuming
a board
it's gonna
meeting
fail.
here. All right, we have a first and a second.
That's fine.
All those in
We have to
favor?
have discussion.
Yeah, you.
Oh.
Now we gotta have discussion.
Okay, back me up.
Slow her down. Okay. So this thing was conditionally rezoned to an M2, I believe, in 07? I don't know if they have it in front of us. So we went in front of the county to have it rezoned to the M2. We did accept the design standards. It was part of the BP district, which I'm wondering if that's the issue you guys are having with the zoning. Because the design standards were part of the big issue when we went to the BP zoning versus the M2. This was it was conditionally rezoned back, I think it was 07 to the M2. when Ford, or, can't remember his name, tall
Cor-
fella.
Yes, and it never, the conditions were never met, and it was therefore not zoned. The concerns are obviously the JPC, the BP language has slightly different uses than the M2, although I'm sure that could be worked out over time. The other concern is that the BP1 language in the code has certain JPC authority versus just advisory conditions, and that is obviously of great import to what might get built or not built. If it's advisory, well then we talk and it happens or it doesn't happen, whereas requirements of approval are vastly different to make sure that that's a entryway corridor into the village that meets our standards. That's the whole idea of the special district. So that's the difference.
So with the standards, looking at some of the stuff that's in the BP zoning versus the stuff that's in the M2, what is in particular would be an issue? As long as it's built to the same similar size as what's in the village, design standards, is that going to be a problem, or are we looking? Do we want to be more strict or more restrictive than what's in the village?
I think we want to make sure that the JPC has the approval authority versus just advisory, because things change over time. And again, I think there are different uses between the M2 and BP1. They're not all the same. And that's, without having analyzed all of that, there is some concern about the different uses between the two.
I guess one thing we'd be concerned about is with some of the zoning that's being discussed and some of the standards. We don't want to be held to more restrictive standards than you would hold your own village to. That's something that we definitely don't want. And giving the JPC control over that is a little concerning to me.
It would still be tied to those design standards and those things that are in that code, in the BP.
And there already.
Yeah.
Do we necessarily have to tie the CSM to the zoning?
Do we have to tie it? Well, the village couldn't support it if they don't support the manufacturing zoning. They can't support that the document, shows it as that being in that zoning.
You don't
This
support
goes
the
back to-
manufacturing zoning? That's right, what's next door.
Right, but it's supposed to be BP1.
It's completely consistent with what it's next to.
Well, it's our position, it's not consistent with the original agreement and the whole history. And as the administrators indicated, it's a matter of whether it's advisory or permitted.
So that's the issue more than if it's advisory or permitted.
Because it applies to all of the districts. We're setting precedent on all of the districts and all of the issue, and that's why we asked for a 5C to be put on. I might, and I may be presumptuous, to ask that we pass the motion. I think the presentation will explain it better as to where our position is. If you allow Jeremy to courtesy of going through his presentation, and then we can come back.
We could postpone B and go to C and come back.
That's
be
what
okay
I'm
with
requesting.
that. We'd have to have.
Oh, you mean pass on?
Yeah,
Table
just,
or...
just not
we already have a motion.
Right, so we would table it.
I think we can back that up.
Well,
we could just table it, or just as a courtesy say, we'll bypass voting, and as part of the discussion, go to agenda C.
we have a motion and a second. How do you want to proceed with that?
They can withdraw, right?
Well, they could withdraw the motion, or they could table the motion until after agenda item C.
I just want to do it proper, whatever.
Yes. Counselor, do you agree if they just table it until after agenda C and remove it from
Return
the
to
table? We're fine.
That's fine. It's ultimately up to members of the town here, to agree to that point. Except if there's no objection.
The formal way would be that, if there's no objection, the chairman could just do it. We move things around on agendas all the time. We don't usually do it while a motion is pending.
That's what I mean, because the motion was made and seconded. If it hadn't been a motion and second, I would have just moved it, but now that there's been a motion and second, do we have to vote on the motion, or can we just procedurally?
I'd have it withdrawn, just whoever made the motion can withdraw a motion. Or a counter motion can be made.
That's fine.
Yeah, I'll make a motion to withdraw.
Just withdraw.
Just
Okay.
withdraw.
Let's move on to item C, discussion necessary action on Town of Lisbon zoning code amendments.
So in a brief few seconds here, we do have a presentation for tonight, but we do have some questions because the county called us about this, so we thought we'd ask. and to try to get some understanding.
Just so you know, we got no information in our packet on this right
No,
now.
I understand.
So-
Yeah, we understand. So the first question was, we've understood that the town of Lisbon has proposed a code text amendment to the county to change the language of the BP district and some of its requirements. And so we're asking, did that happen? And if so, what is that code amendment? And could we get a copy of it if we don't have it
Well, what
tonight?
sections are you referring to? You just,
BP1.
and what section of the code specifically? Number?
Well, you proposed it's our understanding you proposed a text amendment to the BP district zone of the zoning code.
So you're looking for anything that's related to the BP zoning code that's been
Yeah.
requesting an amendment? Okay.
All right, yeah, so sections 27, 28, which have been approved, amendments have been made to sections 27, 28 of our zoning code. They've been approved by the town board. They are before the county right now. The county is in the process of reviewing and providing comment. That's at the state of where we're at with two areas of our zoning code. At the moment, does that provide enough information?
It's our understanding that as part of that, the leads reference within the code was being struck.
I'd have to go back and look. I mean, there's nothing presented in the packet here, and this is still in, a phase where it's being reviewed by the county. So I'd have to go back and look at that because it is not a state where it is a formal document and been approved by the county. I mean, at this point in time, providing that information is of no use or no consequence to the JPC at the moment. I mean, once the county has an opportunity to approve it and it takes no more issue with it, then at that time it could be provided.
But the town board acted, so it's a public record.
Yeah,
I'm pulling it up.
And the second,
Was the public hearing held?
There should have been.
It was a while ago.
and I guess it follows up with the second question from the village of Sussex to the town to explain why the town of Lisbon felt it could unilaterally and without JPC action make that code amendment.
Well, it's not, I mean, it has full authority to do it. The JPC is, if you look very clearly at the boundary agreement, that it's an advisory body, provides recommendations and comments. So, the town has full authority to act. It doesn't need to seek JPC approval, and JPC approval is not absolutely required. So, I mean, that's...
Well, council, you'd agree that certain things are required of the JPC and certain things are advisory. Everything's not advisory. The truck wash isn't advisory.
No.
That's correct, but generally speaking, I mean, I'm looking at the boundary agreement right now. JPC shall serve in an informal advisory body, and its determinations or recommendations will not be binding upon any municipality.
Except for as part of the,
But I think perhaps now we understand where the towns. We still would like a copy of the proposed code text amendments. I think at this
It's
point,
on our website too, I believe. It was
They're
on
on
our
there,
meeting
too.
agenda websites.
at this point we do have. I have some hard copies that you can go and pass those out.
Yeah,
Here, the first one.
for you.
No, I have one.
So everybody.
Yep, they can have a copy. But we do have a presentation tonight too, from the JP's perspective, and you're going to get a hard copy of it. Just going back to the history of this area and the code and the JP's for reference and conversation. So, this is about why we feel Lisbon could not unilaterally change the language of the PP1 industrial district or rezone the leased property to M2 without JPC approval. So the boundary stipulation, as council correctly pointed out, requires the creation of a land use plan for the town. The JPC, the direct quote from it, the JPC shall prepare a formal land use plan for the joint planning area for consideration and approval by the town, and the village board is honored before December 31st, 2004. It actually happened in '05, because there were some extensions given. In 2005, the village and town did agree to a land use plan as required by that boundary stipulation, and that land use plan in itself called out joint planning areas where the JPC would be advisory, and several special use district areas within which the JPC approval was required, with some of which we just talked about tonight in the B5, or B4. The village's BP1 for industrial and B5 for commercial zoning district, and the village's design standards would be used by the JPC until the JPC approves zoning districts and design standards for these special use district areas. And the language on adoption of the land use plan, right here, specifically requires the town of Lisbon and implementing its land use plan to adopt zoning regulation and design standards comparable to those of the existing in the village of Sussex for the special use districts, and said zoning regulations and design standards shall be reviewed and approved by the JPC, whose approval shall not be unreasonably held. So the special use districts do require the JPC to sign off initially on the creation of the code, and then arguably to make modifications therein after the fact. And that's from the language that was adopted with the land use plan. In November, and that was all in '05. So, for many people in the room, myself, John Macy, I don't know if you were on at the time, Joe. We got that far, and then we didn't do anything for 3 years. And we got to '08, and that has led to a lot of the disagreements and challenges on this matter. In November of 2008, the village and town held a joint planning committee meeting to actually start the process of creating those zoning districts. Joe was there, he's referenced throughout the minutes, and I know that, Annette, you were there too, and Attorney Gutenkunst and Macy, and the planner at the time was Mr.
Stigler.
Stigler, thank you very much. So as part of those minutes is the meeting of 11/25. I read the conditions of county approval of the Lisbon land use plan, which was on the previous page. And said that the zoning regulations and design standards need to be similar to the village's PC1 in the interim. The JPC reviewed its purpose, which I provided you. It talks about what areas are the 4 special planning districts, what the codes are, where it's JPC is advisory, where it's not. The JPC accepted those joint planning committee purpose statements as part of their action, and you have a copy of it within there. The town and village did agree at that time, disagree, I want to make sure I said disagreed about the industrial portion of Leeds, as whether that was one of the special districts. And there's quite a bit of conversation, if you look at the minutes, about that disagreement and in relation to it. The parties did agree, however, to work on an ordinance language that would be amenable to all parties. So at that same November 25th meeting of '08, Ms. Gutenkunst, who is the town attorney, suggested that the JPC assume that the Leeds parcel is in a special area and see what we can come up with. And the JPC members accepted that assumption for the point in time. So there wasn't necessarily agreement, but there was an agreement to work together. That was the concept. And the next JPC meeting was scheduled for December 11th, and the staff of both the town and the village were directed to work together. So that did occur. Jeff Boucher was the town administrator at the time. Jeff and myself and Mr. Stigler and Sandy Sarah from the county all worked together in December of 2008, and the JPC agreed to BP Industrial Business Park Special Use Zoning Code language, and that it was to apply to the Leeds site. On December 12th of '08, I commented about what a great meeting we had as staff to prepare those documents and work through our differences, and we prepared a BP1 document that was presented to the committee. As part of that meeting, Ms. Kramer, who's here tonight, seconded by Steve Palacio, who was a town plan commission member, recommended to the village board adoption of that ordinance that the group had created, the BP1 zoning district, with the changes that had been discussed by the JPC that evening. and to adopt the town design standards. Those design standards are still the ones that you're using today. Mr. Stigler specifically requested that a reference be made to the properties that are subject to this ordinance, the BP ordinance, so there would be no confusion on what properties were included in this area. And at the 43rd minute mark of that audio tape, Mr. Stigler points out this includes the western part of the Leeds Nursery, and then went on to list other properties that the BP Industrial Park Special Use District would apply to. The addition of the above areas into the motion was approved by the first and second of the motion after Mr. Stigler's request. And then Mr. Gerke, who was actually a town supervisor at the time, Mr. Reed was the chairman, and was seconded by Mr. Osterman to recommend the same. And then Mr. Lepsinski and Mr. Gerke thanked the staff and the members of the committee for working so hard to create that district and that language. The code language then went to the Town Plan Commission, whereby the town made revisions. The Plan Commission and or board made revisions, and it came back to the JPC on March 12, 2009, where they went over those revisions that had come from the town. The March 12th meeting, there was quite a bit of clarification and discussion about the legal basis for the JPC authority with respect to the village and town plan commissions and the boards. Mr. Reed, who was the chairman of the town at the time, stated that he asked to put on the agenda for that clarification purpose. And myself presented, we walked through the JPC meeting, the boundary agreement, the memo entitled Joint Planning Committee Purpose, which we talked about earlier. To review, consider, and comment on all applications for rezoning, conditional use, PUDs, and plats that arise within the JPA. And I also talked about that the JPC was to prepare a formal land use plan for JPA for consideration and approval, which had been completed. And then 4 special districts were created as part of that land use plan, and there was disagreement about those areas, but that the JPC was prepare a design standards and the code's BP1 zoning district until the town's code was complete. The special districts, the JPC has higher review authority than in those other areas. So for most of the town, it is advisory, and for that area, it is not, for the special use districts.
Okay.
The parties agreed on the JPC's role and authority, and they understood that there was some advisory in some areas of requirements. Mr. Reed, again, the town chairman at the time, stated that the bond agreement determined the authority of the JPC, except for the special business districts. The town attorney, Ms. Gutenkunst, and these are direct quotes from the minutes of the JPC meeting, Ms. Gutenkunst stated that was correct, except for those districts identified in the land use plan, and that the argument is whether Leeds is one of those districts, is a special district. The town was worried that the ordinance and design standards would apply everywhere in the town, not just those special use districts, and that was clarified to be no. The ordinances and the design standards only applied to the special use districts, which included Leeds. That same March 12th meeting, the village president at the time, Mr. Lepsinski, stated that the JPC approval did include some commercial areas, just the Leeds property, or did not include some commercial areas, just the Leeds property. Mr. Gerke stated that he agreed that some of the language is generic, however, the agreement only applies to those 2 specific areas. Mr. Gerke stated that the confusion on the town's part was more about generic language in the document, and Mr. Stigler, who's the town's planner, stated that the village forwarded the design standards with some language that led us to believe that it applied to the entire town. Mr. Stigler stated that the documents are now edited to say industrial only. The town had made changes to the ordinance without consulting the village, and this concerned the village, and that was discussed at that meeting as well. The village president stated that the bigger question is how the town views the JPC, and whether the town feels like they can take a document, revise it, and pass it without sending it back to the JPC. The town iterated that this language was subject to the JPC, and the process was used only to help speed up the timeline. Mr. Reed, who was the town chairman, stated that he took the changed documents to the town board and the town plan commission at a special meeting, and that they had approved both documents with the intent to take the changes to the JPC for approval. Mr. Osterman stated that the approval was contingent upon approval of the JPC, and Mr. Reed stated he was trying to short-circuit the process to return to the JPC later, but didn't want to hold up leads. Mr. Reed stated that the town had never done this process before, and they were trying to figure it out, and all they wanted to talk about was leads. And then unfortunately, other areas of the town had gotten brought up in the meetings. Leads inclusion in the special district continued to be a sticking point, but there was a compromise to use the new VP zoning district on leads. So at that March 12th meeting, Ms. Gutenkund stated that the only special district disputed is the leads property. She further stated that the JPC didn't want to wait, this referring to the town members of the JPC. So they compromised and worked to find a solution, which is what happened. Ms. Gutenkund stated there was a meeting of the minds and the village would work us on the solution. Ms. Gutenkund stated that we can go round and round and round about whether Leeds is or is not in the special district, but we're trying to move this forward. Ms. Gutenkund stated that they concur on the other parcels that the land use applies to. With the compromise in place, the JPC began to work its way through the actual language of the code, the BP district. We reviewed section 3 of the special business park. We reviewed many sections, most of which are not relevant to the conversation tonight, but we reviewed section 3 of the special business park zoning district, which is on page 1. Then at the time, section 33 of the proposed code. I know it's 28 now, when the town recodified.
Jeremy, can I pause you for 1 second?
Yeah.
So back when we were discussing this with the Leeds property, it had already been contingently rezoned to M2. And the only thing that we were really in discussion at the time was the design standards, correct?
No, we were talking about the code itself.
But I mean, the design standards were the sticking point at the time that this was being discussed. Because the M2 had already been contingently done before the zoning code was passed, thus they would have had to been allowed. But what we had been talking about at the time was actually this to design standards, and actually what the sticking point was the outside storage at the time.
Outside storage was a major issue.
And that was addressed.
We were talking about the authority versus not authority of the special district.
Right, but in reference to the Leeds property, it was, I do remember this, it was contingently rezoned to the M2, which was in process at that time. But the design standards and the outside storage was the issue at that time.
There was concern about the town's proposed M2 zoning.
Right, there's some building design standards too, which is what I'm talking about. But,
yeah, that was all part of it. It was all part and part. I mean,
but it was contingently rezoned M2 at that time. Before before this had even happened.
I mean, that was one of the concerns the village had.
Okay, but it was, correct?
I'd have to go back to the time. I know that you were attempting to conditionally rezone it M2.
Okay.
That's a fair statement.
Thank you.
So we went through the code section 3, and specifically the language about the special business park district is initially comprised of the Leeds parcel of 44.98 acres, which is currently in the town's code, was agreed to run this location. Mr. Macy, the village attorney, was there, and there was a concern about, well, not all of it was Leeds, and so the addition of, as well as other special use districts, was added to clear up that problem. The members of the JPC, all unanimous, agreed to keep that sentence in. Leeds 44.98 acres within the BP1. Mr. Smith stated that the purpose of the deed restriction was an interim step. So at the time, Ms. Gutenkund had filed a deed restriction against the property, saying that they would follow this code sections even though it was zoned M2. It was an attempt to find a compromise, but it was an interim step. There was a desire to get approval for the Leeds development at the time. Mr. Smith reviewed section 4 of the special business park zoning district regarding the JPC's role, again, making it not advisory but required. Mr. Smith stated the village doesn't uphold the language that Mr. Stigler had asked for, and reiterated the words in the boundary agreement to be put into the documents. There was discussion about what would happen if there was a dispute, because we were obviously disputing the Leeds and the special use district. So at that same March 12th meeting, Mr. Macy stated that creating the design standards in the districts must be agreed to by this body, and when a building permit is needed to be issued, the village's BP1 district controls until the JPC adopts the new BP district, which is a very specific question. Ms. Gutenkund stated that a land use plan issue can use arbitration and mediation if there was a disagreement about the same. Mr. Stigler stated that the Plan Commission had asked on a Monday for a special meeting to make amendments, and Mr. Stigler stated that he would put in the motion that the JPC would exercise its rights for the boundary agreement and land use plan, but if the map was in dispute, he could state that they would follow the arbitration and mediation. Mr. Gerke, who was a member of the town supervisors, stated that it would take longer to hammer out something if they follow arbitration and mediation. Mr. Reed, town chairman, stated that these are still questions, and regardless if a property is in or out of a special district, and these documents are approved, 5 years down the road, and I guess it's more like 8, the town will want a modification, and the whole argument starts over again with different owners. Mr. Reed stated that he was asking for a determination. Ms. Gutenkund stated that the deed restriction had been completed. Mr. Smith stated that the deed restriction was an interim mechanism, as in the future lands would be zoned. Ms. Gutenkund stated that Leeds has agreed to the deed restriction. Mr. Teach, who was the village administrator at the time, stated that knowing that it was the intent of the town to rezone the Leeds property to the BP district, the village and staff knew the deed restriction was the interim step. The JPC talked in great length about the BP district and Leeds, and the JPC got support from Lisbon Plan Commission members and Menominee Falls staff, who had oversight roles in this property. At the time, if you remember, the Menominee Falls was attempting to take over the part of the property, and they certainly had extraterritorial control over it.
They weren't looking to take over the property, they were looking for ETZ authority, which actually was not for this property, it was for the Highland property, which was down the road. But they were exercising their ETC rights, which only applied to a portion of it, which is actually considered the commercial end.
Matt Karen and another one of the town planners were at the meeting and have comments in the record about it.
Just to be clear.
Discussion and possible action on the recommendation for the creation of the special business. So, again, still at the 312 meeting, I reviewed the JPC issues to discuss with the design standards. We went through those. I asked the committee to discuss the design standards. Mr. Stigler stated that the town had an issue with using the same language for the commercial properties. Again, that was the B5 district versus the B.
Just one other thing on the ETZ portion. I don't believe the Falls actually exercised any of their rights moving forward. They started the process, but they actually never finished it.
I think you are correct. I think that's
Just to
correct.
make sure that that's noted.
Mr. Teach stated that the town asked if the design standards could apply to the whole town, and the answer is that if the town decided it wanted to, it could, but it was not required to. Mr. Reed stated that at the Plan Commission level, they agreed they would only talk about Leeds, not all the other districts. Mr. Gerke asked why other properties would be different than the Leeds property. Mr. Smith stated that the current proposal was not written just for Leeds. Ms. Scherer, who is the county planner, I believe was the liaison to Lisbon. I don't want to misstate what her role was, but she's the county planner. Stated that the original intent was to have a BP district similar to the village's BP1 and B5 districts, and set of design standards for Leeds and for those other districts. Mr. Stigler stated it didn't really matter because the two districts must be similar to the village of Sussex, and it was not a problem to add commercial to the document. We ended that meeting saying, I'll have all the changes that the committee looked at done by 3 p.m. tomorrow, because the next meeting for the JPC would be March 18th, just a mere 6 days later. The town chairman asked the Lisbon Plan Commissioners, Steve Panton and Jade Stadler, if they were okay with what they heard. Both Mr. Panton and Ms. Stadler were okay with the discussion that they heard. They were Lisbon Plan Commission members. Tony Lapsinski, the village president, asked if representatives from the village of Menominee Falls were okay with tonight's, and the two representatives of Menominee Falls stated they were. Part of that 312 meeting, there was discussion and action on the creation of the district. Mr. Macy stated the design standards will apply to all industrial developments and Leeds, that the town needs to create a zoning district for the special districts. The members of the JPC agreed with the continuation of this process. Mr. Stigler stated that not all of Leeds property was in the special district, just 44 acres. On March 16th, Mr. Reed stated that he asked Mr. Stigler for a map of those parcels that are affected. Mr. Stigler stated that the town's land use plan from 0304 described the areas in a general sense. Mr. Stigler stated that the areas include Leeds, the area north of Silver Spring, south of the high school, the Highland Family Farm in Hamilton, the area south of Highway K and Highway 74, and the area north of Lisbon Road containing approximately 100 acres. As an exhibit, the town planner in 2019 sent us a document of parcel showing the portion that we're talking about tonight with the zone is 44.9852 acres. The remainder parcel, the commercial piece, is only 29 acres. So we were all talking about 44 acres. So, and while we don't necessarily agree with this, at a minimum would be 44 acres. There's 15 acres of the part that we're talking about, even under the town zone, supposition that would be under the special zoning district. Again, we believe the whole thing is, but the math doesn't add up from the exhibits. The JPC does have additional review authority within the BP Business Park District, and it's a particular concern to the village, because advisory is one thing, requirement is a very another. And so on 316, there was discussion about that and about the review process. I'm not gonna go through the whole review process. You know it, it's in your town code, you can read it, and see when it's allowed and when it's not, and when it's advisory. And I'm almost done. The village of town agreed on the language. So at that March 16th meeting, we reviewed section 33, we reviewed the JPC roles and authority again, and after consideration and approval by the JPC, the development would return to the town to follow their processes. Mr. Stigler stated he hadn't heard yet from Mrs. Scherer, but that he was comfortable and felt this was the right way to go. Mr. Stigler stated that the trigger that required enforcement was not left at recording a document, but at approving the document. And a motion by Reed, seconded by Kramer, to recommend that the Town Plan Commission and the Town Board and the Village Plan Commission and the Village Board adopt Section 33 Industrial Business Park Special Use Zoning, which you have it dated March 13th, 2009, as presented by staff, and provided that a map be added to the document after approved by the JPC. All members voted yes. The Town Plan Commission, the Town Board, and the county went on to adopt the BP Industrial Business Park Special Use and make it officially part of the town zoning code, including the language requiring Leeds 44.98 acres to be part of that district. The Leeds reference language in the code was requested by Lisbon's town planner, John Stigler. Remember back at the December meeting, that wasn't something the village asked for, it was something the town asked for. And the village board also approved that language. So Exhibit F just shows you, and you know it because it's in your current code and it's what you propose changing. The zoning district is initially comprised of the Leeds parcel of 44.98 acres, very similar to the 44.9852 acres that's on the exhibit that came from the town. So in summary, the boundary stipulation required a land use plan be created. It's an essential pillar of that stipulation. The Lisbon and Sussex included special use districts within the land use plan where the communities had to create specific zoning and design standards for these districts. Those zoning and design standards had to be approved by the JPC. Lisbon and Sussex adopted the BP standard and the B4 commercial special use districts, as well as design standards, and we used them, we talked about them tonight with the B4. Lisbon and Sussex agreed that in some instances the role of the JPC would be advisory, and for other actions their consent would be required. Throughout the entire process there was a discussion as to whether or not Leeds property was to be included in part or total. And ultimately the town specifically listed the adopted zoning code text that the Leeds property is to be in the BP1 district. By the town taking that action, the village relied on the same and had every reason to believe that the matter was resolved and the Leeds property was to be included. It wasn't until July of last year when the town went to rezone the property to M2 instead of BP1 that the village became aware the town did not intend to honor the adopted special use code. The town does have an obligation to use the mediation and arbitration provision of the boundary agreement before taking unilateral action to change the special use zoning code. So our positions are really as four. Changes to the BP Industrial Business Park require JPC approval. The 44.98 acres of leased property must be rezoned to BP1 special use zoning district. To rezone the 44.98 acres of leased property to other than the BP1 requires JPC approval. And to change the role of the JPC within the BP1 requires JPC approval. And so that's the history, that's the minutes. I'm sure we'll be talking about this in mediation, but that's why the BP code is so important to the village of Sussex, because it's a fundamental tenet of the boundary stipulation.
What kind of action are you seeking on item C tonight?
Oh, we can read it.
Yeah. Is this one here?
We would look for a motion that text changes to the Town of Lisbon BP Industrial Business Park Special Use Zoning Code requires JPC approval.
JPC can't give that authorization. That's a town board action.
We
just
believe
gave
that
a
that's what the current, we're asking for the JPC position.
That's a board action. That's an elected body action, John. That's not something the JPC, you're asking the JPC if it wants to grant itself authority to do this. You can't ask that body. You gotta ask the governing body, which is the town Lisbon board.
What we're asking, and maybe it's not phrased as artfully as you would like, we were trying to keep it simple, that the current history, based on the current history, JPC currently has, that's the position that they take or don't take. That's different than what the town board may agree or disagree. They may agree or disagree as whether we have a conditional use or permitted use for the car wash. That's why.
Yeah, but you're asking basically with that motion asking for them to grant themselves authority, though.
No, we're asking them to decide whether they currently have that authority.
That's not something this board does.
I respectfully disagree. You just did it. You just said we decided we'd rather have a conditional use than a permitted use for a car wash. I leaned over to Jeremy and he said, "Boy, that's pretty presumptuous of the Joint Plan Commission. That's a town plan commission and town board decision."
That was your motion. That was your worded motion that I made.
You didn't object to that motion. We're asking for a very similar motion.
No, it is not in any way, shape, or form.
Absolutely. It goes to whether the JPC.
I'm going to use a phrase that we're going to use a lot in the coming weeks. We'll just agree to disagree.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But we're going to make the motion, and, we feel it's an appropriate motion. We want to go on record as to whether the JPC feels they have that jurisdiction or not, based on the history. And I think that's a fair question.
I'm fairly certain you're going to have 3 votes on Sussex saying yes and 3 votes on Lisbon saying no.
And the motion fails, and that's our record that we need.
I'll so move on that motion that was presented.
One second.
Any discussion?
I have a question. So this amendment lists 44.96 acres. What is the actual acreage we're talking about? It doesn't match. So the stuff that Gina says, whereas the town of Lisbon, it's on the amendment to ordinance 10/19.
I guess I have.
44.96.
44.96, and I see stuff that's different.
Annette, are you more referring to the item B right now or C?
I guess I'm really,
I think she's just asking for clarification on how much land we're talking about there.
yeah,
I mean, does that,
we're getting different numbers. and
well,
that's
does that number include where the office was and everything else now? Does that include the whole property?
The 44 acres is what you see. Well, I don't know on that one.
Oh,
I guess you'd have to overlay it.
According to their map, it's 44.9852.
Okay.
Apparently, they rounded that to 44.9.
I mean, if you look, yeah, I guess it's hard. I can't tell on this black and white.
No, I just so I'm understanding.
mm-hmm.
But basically, what we're asking, just to clarify the motion, is whether or not the action taken by the town board and the plan commission and then town board, they've gutted everything from the BP industrial business zoning district that refers to the joint planning. All of the work that was done all of that years is now stricken by this amendment, which is, I've seen for the first time tonight, but I've got both of them up in front of me. You took out all of the meat.
So the motion is to, the motion reads that text changes to the Town of Lisbon BP Industrial Business Park Special Use Zoning Code requires JPC approval. That motion was made and seconded.
Made and seconded, and you asked for discussion.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Nay.
The second motion would be that any action to rezone any portion of the Leeds property requires JPC approval.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Nay.
Who were the motion makers?
Here and
Okay,
here.
thanks.
Mhm.
And I guess that takes us back to B. Item B.
Yeah, I'll state again on that item that you do not have to determine the zoning to approve a CSM. If the CSM meets, in this case, it would meet both BP1 and M2. So it's, you wouldn't have a conflict either way. mean, obviously the road needs to be named, but the other comment is a general comment, not a plat addition that would be needed.
And the
It wouldn't appear on the right.
The M2 zoning that was passed by the county did include the design standards of the BP district, correct?
Well, may I ask for clarification from your council? This document is dated February 5th, 2020. There's no way I've ever heard of anybody getting through the county in 30 days. So is it pending before the county? Has it gone to Loopy? Has it gone to Parks and Land
Went to
Use?
the county board,
The chapter 28
I believe.
went through Bay County, or Plan Commission, and it's going to county board on March 24th.
Correct.
The first one or the second? Or both of them?
Section 28. There's section 27 and section 28. 27 is working through the county
The
process
Leeds
right
M2.
now.
That's what we're talking. You're talking about the Leeds M2 rezone.
Okay, and thank you for that color. Which one is where? 27 is where? I figured out which one's 27. It took me a while. 27 is just the rezoning of the Leeds to the that's the short one.
Yeah, Leeds property rezone ordinance is amendment to ordinance 10-19. And then section 28 is amendment to ordinance 20-19.
You said 27 was going to county board.
That one's just working its way through now. Yeah, it hasn't gotten to Parks and Land Use yet.
27.
27. 28's farther ahead than 27.
Okay. So 28 is going to the county board.
Mm-hmm.
And you said March.
24th.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, approval subject to the lands being zoned before.
Okay, I'd like to make a motion for B, for a motion for approval for the zoning to be BP1.
Approval of the CSM,
Oh,
subject to.
Approval of the CSM subject to the zoning being BP1. I so move.
I'll second that.
Okay, this discussion. Josh, you're maintaining that a certified survey map does not require.
That's a general comment. It doesn't say you have to put the zoning on the map. And you look at the state statutes, the only time it talks about zoning is with regards to the county anyway. And this would meet both. I mean, I've looked up the standards for lot size and lot width. From a zoning point of view, this would meet the BP and the M2.
Okay. Does Sussex have an issue with the CSM as it stands, irregardless of the zoning at this point?
I think from the planner's perspective, it's not required to be, but it certainly is a reasonable one that the board has made that, so that's.
No, I'm asking about is the CSM as far as the design of it. Is there an issue with the design of the CSM as it stands?
I don't think there's an issue with the design, but the methodology by which it, came about and the rezoning, the totality of the circumstances, that's the purpose of the motion. And we have the right to make that position if we want to make that position.
I didn't discourage you, right, John? I'm asking a question. I'm
Yeah.
asking a question on whether or not it's an M2 or a BP1. Is the design of the CSM, is there any issue with it?
I think that's why we recommended approval subject to it being zoned.
So if it was M2 or BP1, the design is okay. It's just you want it to be zoned BP1.
As the village attorney stated, the process by which we got here is what our concern is.
It's the process, not the design.
Yeah.
Okay. And even with the design standards being accepted into the M2. So the issue the village has is they want JPC authority on this, not just recommending. That's what this is all stemming down to.
That's a part of it, yes.
What's the other part?
Well, that you think you can arbitrarily change the zoning and the land use plan and gut the entire purpose of the border.
But that was C, not
to be
B,
perfect.
correct?
Well, but they're all tied together. That's why we asked to skip to C to go back to B.
Well, but B is
an
discussion on
example.
the CSM,
B
though,
is an
John.
example of C.
Well, you know, at some point, the applicant has to proceed at their own risk. The applicant has asked for a CSM to be approved. You approve it with zoning being in limbo. That's the risk they're willing to take. I mean, at some point, you have to allow the applicant to move forward and allow them to take the risks as they may. And if they're meeting the, you know, the letter of the law, putting together a CSM correctly, aside from the road name,
Right.
and the engineering specifications, the survey specifications, that's sort of their right. Of course, you have the right to do what you want to do, but
Okay, so we have a motion and a second on the table.
Correct.
So all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Nay. I'd make a motion to accept the town's of Lisbon's 4-lot certified survey map for the property located at North 63, West 22039, County Road F, tax LSBT 02401.999 as presented. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Discussion. So this would be doing it as M2, but accepting the design standards as recommended by Waukesha County for the BP1. All in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Opposed.
Motion 3-3. Item 6 is adjournment. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
I'll second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries at 7:31.
Gina, you got that motion? It was pretty simple.
Yep.
Your 20-some years of experience, I figured you got it. I did write it out in big letters, though, that we could hand it to you.
I got
But
it.
I'm always sensitive to that, Gina. You
I know, thank you.
40 years of doing this.
I'm on my third keyboard already here. Turn them out. After a while, you can't read the letters on the keys anymore.
That's a problem.
Well, I know where they are, except when someone else goes to my desk, they're like, because I have the ergonomic split keyboard. Nobody likes using my desk.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Great.
I'll send it to you electronically tomorrow.
Perfect, thank you. I could kind of see it, I'm like squinting at it, I'm like, I got the glasses, but it's a little too far away.
Are you keeping Brady or not?
I hope it